Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues of the Goethe Institute. I'm really happy to welcome you here to the so-called Philip Brady lecture. And that's why I'm so very happy to do this, because it's my first event here as the director of the Goethe Institute in London. I just started here the 1st of November and just coming from Sao Paulo, Brazil, which is a little different atmosphere, but I think the theme here is quite the same there. So unfortunately, obviously, we have global themes to deal with. I would like to talk a little bit about why we have this Brady lecture here. It's a tradition we have since a while, and it's called Brady lecture because it's in commemoration of Philip Brady, who was a Germanist, but also a fan, a lover of German culture, and he was very passionate about it. And so the idea was to invite important representatives of the British intellectual, cultural scene to who have a link, a connection, a strong passion for Germany and German culture. And we also have the son of Philip Brady here, Dr. Martin Brady, who's obviously followed the footsteps of his father because he's a German and very passionate about German culture and a specialist on film. So welcome, especially Martin. But it's also I think a good chance for us to deal with themes that have relations that are in relation between Germany and Britain. And of course, in the moment, we have issues that are very strong, facing a momentum. I don't want to mention it, but I think it's the white elephant in the room. So I came here just in time to be part of this very nice event. And I would like to introduce our important representative of the British cultural and intellectual scene, Brendan Sims. He will talk about Germany in the age of schisms, and I won't tell you what it's all about. He will tell you. I just want to introduce him. He's a professor of history of international relations in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge. He has a very close relation to Germany because his mother is German. He speaks brilliantly Hochdeutsch. He went to a German school in Dublin and studied in Tübingen and Mainz and Munich. It is very interesting that he visited several institutes, Goethe institutes in Europe, but never came to London. So it's the first time here. We're very happy. He's the author of many publications, out of which I want to only mention a few. One is Europe, the Struggle of Supremacy, 1453 to the present. Then The Longest Afternoon, the 400 Men Who Decided the Battle of Waterloo. Then Britain's Europe, 1,000 Years of Conflict and Cooperation. It's a very popular book. And Europe and a German publication, Europa am Abgrund, you can translate it like Europe at the brink of disaster, which was published. No? Wouldn't you? Yes, okay. This was published in Germany by the Beck Verlag. And I just heard that his new book, that is nearly finished, is on Adolf Hitler. So we are very curious to read that. He's the president of the Henry Jackson Society, which advocates the view that is supporting and promoting liberal democracy and liberal interventionism. And he's the founder and the president of the Project for Democratic Union, a Munich-based student-organized think tank on Europe politics. But I don't want to keep you longer, as everybody's waiting to hear what Brandon Sims has to say about the future of Britain and relation to Germany, and I suppose the EU as well. And if I understood you well, Brandon, you will argue that the situation of Brexit is not totally a new one. So we are all very curious what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to begin, in fact, by thanking the Goethe Institute and Katharina von Richterschell for asking me to speak. It's a great honor to give this lecture named after Philip Brady. And I also found the process of gathering my thoughts for my 35 to 40 minutes or so of remarks very useful. And they're somewhat experimental. As the European crisis deepens, politicians, commentators, and academics have reached for historical analogies to explain the present turbulence. On one side of the argument, prominent among British Remainers and the liberal mainstream in continental Europe, is the contention that the populist surge of the past decade resembles that of the 1930s. No, say the Leavers. The current crisis should rather be seen as the continuation of Britain's long struggle against domination by a European hegemon, be it Philip II of Spain, Napoleonic France, or Nazi Germany. Just before the referendum, Boris Johnson notoriously compared the European Union to Hitler's Third Reich. More recently, Jeremy Hunt warned that the European Union risked becoming what he called a prison like the Soviet Union. Now, there is something in all these analogies, Remainer and Leaver. It's true that the current confrontation between the United Kingdom and the European Union marks the resumption of the centuries-old clash of ordering principles between their predecessors. And I'll come back to that repeatedly later on. There are certain parallels, for example, between Napoleon's continental system and the exclusive economic order of the European Union. It is also true that Britain has stood in the past against Nazi and Soviet tyranny. That said, it is obviously foolish to equate the European Union, which generally tries to safeguard human rights and the rule of law, with the Soviet Union, still less with the genocidal dictatorship of Adolf Hitler. In fact, Hitler was explicitly and vigorously opposed to the concept of European integration, and I said as much in a piece I wrote in the New Statesman rebutting Boris Johnson's claims. Moreover, the United Kingdom is much more divided domestically over Brexit, about 50-50, as we know, than it ever was over Nazism or the Cold War. So this is a very different animal. Besides, we should be aware of Godwin's law, originally coined to describe internet threads, but actually valid for most political debates, which is that as discussion grows longer, the probability of a comparison involving the Nazis or Hitler becomes a certainty. It marks the point at which dialogue has ended. There is another related law, which is that if both sides believe that the other are Nazis, which is the majority of cases, then the comparison has in any case lost its value. So I won't spend any more time on that. Instead of these analogies, I would like to advance another, which has frequently been suggested, but never, I think, systematically explored, that between Brexit and the Reformation. As befits a lecture at the Goethe Institute London, this will involve some comparison between the English and the German cases. And I hope that by the end we will be able to understand recent events in Europe as part of a new age of schism, or schism, as my colleagues at Pitas insist it should be pronounced. These remarks are offered in the spirit of applied history, which is an art, not a science. The approach throughout eschews whimsy. The comparison should not be taken completely literally, but it is not totally frivolous either. It is a heuristic device to understand not the past but the present, possibly also to point towards the future. And it is a conceit which helps to drive the argument forward. Let me stress at the outset that I am not an expert on Reformation England, let alone Europe, and nor am I an authority on the legal highways and byways of the European Union today. Instead, I'm going to offer some historically based hunches and analogies with which I hope to make sense of what is going on. My reflections have emerged from the work I've been doing as part of the European Orders Project at the Forum on Geopolitics at Cambridge, and the invitation to give this lecture sort of forced me to draw those themes together. So I'm going to be making three principal points. First, that the old church and empire in Europe, in other words, the European Union, is in a severe crisis today comparable to that of the Reformation era. And the English Reformation, obviously Brexit, is only the most serious challenge at the moment. This order is also threatened by a range of other schismatics and heretics to the south, east, and indeed within the Franco-German core. Orthodoxy, the Third Rome in Moscow, is making a comeback. And to the southeast, the Ottoman challenge has also returned, but perhaps we won't go there tonight. Second point, that the differing historical trajectories of England, and as an Irishman I use this term advisedly, and Germany after 1500, explain their contrasting approach to the European order today. In England, London gradually extended its control across the entire British Isles. With some exceptions, Parliament was supreme. Protestantism became the dominant religion. In Germany, as we'll see, sovereignty was, with some exceptions, diffused, and religious strife ended in a compromise. In constitutional terms, we might call this the contrast between Union and Reich, or Empire, which prefigures the antithesis between the United Kingdom and the European Union we see today. Third point, that the contrasting English and German experiences since the Reformation also explain their fundamentally different attitude to sovereignty within the European context. If the United Kingdom has been one of the great ordering powers in Europe, Germany has, with some spectacular exceptions, been a space to be ordered. This was because she was either too weak to prevent herself from being ordered, or so powerful and dangerous that it was too hazardous to allow her to order herself. At best, over the past decades, the history of the Bundesrepublik, she has been a co-ordering power through the institutions of the European Union. So to begin, around 1500, most of Europe was governed by one geo-ideological and geopolitical order, or at least a common imaginary. Catholicism reigned supreme from the west coast of Ireland to the eastern borders of Poland and Lithuania, from the North Cape to the heel of the Italian boot. A wronged wife in Yorkshire could appeal to the papacy for justice, if necessary. You had to go quite far east or southeast to encounter the rival Christian order of Orthodoxy in Muscovy and much of the Balkans. This was the result of an earlier schism in the church, creating the Second Rome in Byzantium and later a Third Rome in Moscow. Europeans referred to their continent as Christendom. They were all united, at least rhetorically, in their opposition to the Muslim infidel, especially the Ottoman Turks. The Pope in Rome was authorized to proclaim a crusade against them, and often did. But this order was already under some pressure. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 sent shockwaves which reverberated throughout the continent. To the west, new worlds were being discovered, so that the traditional cartographic focus on Jerusalem as the center of the universe needed to be rethought. Central, southern, and western Europe were roiled by great dynastic struggles, particularly that between Habsburg and Valois over Italy and the Holy Roman Empire. All this before the Reformation. The Roman Church was generally perceived to be in crisis. Clerical ignorance and corruption, for example, the sale of indulgences, were increasingly regarded as intolerable. Demands for reform were widespread. There were also grumbles in England, one of the great realms of Europe, where the common people chafed under clerical abuses and the monarchy under papal constraints on its authority. Ever since the Middle Ages, the parliamentary statute of Praemunire had made it illegal to sue for justice in a foreign court, at least with regard to high matters of state. But when all was said and done, the sense of inhabiting a political commonwealth was deeply ingrained throughout the continent, despite these challenges and difficulties. This unity, of course, was shattered by the Reformation crisis, which engulfed Europe from the second decade of the 16th century. The challenge to the established church came from many different quarters, starting with the theses which the German monk Martin Luther famously nailed to the door at Wittenberg in 1517. His objections were largely doctrinal, for example, in his insistence on justification by faith alone, rather than good works. I'm not going to get into the theological weeds, you'll be glad to know, but we're simply noting the first rent, as it were, in the garment. Catholic Europe responded with reform, but also with repression. The Church cleaned up its act to a certain extent with the Counter-Reformation, but it also sought to reassert the true faith and papal authority through force of arms. Over the next 200 years or so, our continent was roiled by a time of troubles. There were wars of religion, but also power political struggles between states and within them. Nowhere was this contest as intense as it was in Germany, the heart of Europe. It was ploughed over in the 16th century wars of the Protestant princes against Emperor Charles V, and then traumatically in the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. Germany was then the cockpit of Europe. Protestants and Catholics set about each other. Outside powers intervened at will. Cities such as Magdeburg were sacked amid scenes of extraordinary brutality. The country was nearly annihilated. The experience seared itself so deeply into the national consciousness that in the mid-20th century, shortly after the Second World War, the 30 Years' War was still regarded as its most traumatic period in history. Now, in England, the Reformation began not as a doctrinal dispute over theological truth, which developed into a political contest, but the other way around. It originated, as is well known, as a challenge by Henry VIII against the authority of the Church. To be more specific, his desire to divorce his wife Catherine and marry another in order to produce a male heir. This escalated into a broader assertion of English sovereignty, most strikingly expressed in Parliament's Act of Appeals in 1533, which laid down, quote, that this realm of England is an empire. In other words, England was a legal and political system unto itself, not subject to outside control or interference. There could be no appeal to a higher authority. The doctrine of Praemunire, I mentioned earlier, which had previously really only applied to matters of state, now became the law of the land. More generally, England was sundered from the European legal order. At the same time, Henry VIII relentlessly attacked the institutions of the Church, especially through the dissolution of the monasteries. Central to Henry's vision, though, was his sense of England being an ordering power in Europe. It was not enough for him to be free of papal shackles. Henry wanted to re-establish the English Empire in France, to vindicate Christendom and his role in it, his leading role, in a crusade against the Turks. He even hoped to become Holy Roman Emperor and was a candidate for the crown in the contest from which Charles V of Burgundy emerged victorious. So the Henrician Reformation was only the first step, or conceived as such, in a much wider project for English grandeur in Europe. And it's an interesting counterfactual how the history of Europe would have looked had Henry VIII become Holy Roman Emperor. Would there then have been the Reformation, or indeed Brexit? We can talk about it afterwards. Now, the implementation of the English Reformation was not a linear process, neither with regard to doctrine nor in respect of authority. Henry oscillated doctrinally, but as far as belief was concerned, he effectively died a Catholic. So this is about authority, it's not really about belief. The most far-reaching liturgical changes, such as the prayer book, took place during the reign of Edward VI. This was followed, as you all know, by a reaction under Catholic Queen Mary, one of the bloodiest periods of religious persecution in Europe at the time. She was succeeded by Elizabeth, who pursued a middle way in all things. Much of England remained Catholic for decades, and in the late 17th century, the reign of Charles II, a closet Catholic, and James II, who was openly Catholic, showed that the future was still open. It required outside military intervention by William of Orange, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, to settle the matter. Only in the early 18th century, with the bedding down of the Hanoverian succession, did Protestantism and parliamentary supremacy become firmly and irrevocably established in this country. Now, three things were central to this process of emancipation from the continent. First, the creation of a pro-Reformation constituency. This was, of course, partly acquisitive, the emergence of a whole new class which benefited from the distribution of the spoils from the secularized monasteries. But it was also affective, the widespread sense that Anglicanism represented a fundamental part of what it meant to be English, and that the old church, the Church of Rome, was the faith of foreigners and of traitors. Secondly, the new regime established an ascendancy not merely over England, but over the entire British Isles in the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. I'll come back to that in a minute. Thirdly, England was able to see off various outside attempts at interference and to intervene herself decisively on the mainland. Justly or unjustly, the Catholic or allegedly crypto-Catholic monarchs acquired the reputation of strategic incompetence, or worse still, collusion with foreign powers. Mary's standing has never recovered from the loss of Calais, nor that of Charles II from the Treaty of Dover, by which he effectively sold the country to France in return for Louis XIV's support for the restoration of Catholicism and monarchical authority in England. So, when the Great Schism came to an end in the early 18th century, a very different European order was born. In England, Anglicanism had emerged triumphant, and in the British Isles, Protestantism more generally. The four nations, England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, were progressively welded into a geopolitical unit. Wales and Ireland had already been largely conquered. Scotland, an independent state, let's not forget, until 1603, when it was linked by the Union of the Crowns, was then united to England by the Act of Union in 1707, creating the United Kingdom, the state we live in today. This was done because London was convinced that the protection of English religious and parliamentary liberties required control over the Celtic periphery, which would otherwise be used as a backdoor into England. So continental powers would use Ireland or Scotland, particularly either France or Spain, as a way in to attack England. So that door had to be bolted shut. For the same reason, English strategists believed that the defence of the religious and political settlement in England required the defence of Protestantism and the liberties of Europe, which in fact was the synonym of the balance of power, abroad. Englishmen no longer spoke of Christendom, but of Europe. Now, the new system also delivered on Henry's main ambition, which, as I've said, was to make England, or the United Kingdom, as the expanded state was now called, the principal ordering power in Europe. From the early 18th century to the present day, London has been at the heart of every major European settlement. For example, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which created the balance of power. The many 18th century treaties, I won't list them all. The Treaty of Vienna in 1815, which brings to an end the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. That order is largely created by Castlereagh with Metternich, but inconceivable without British power and Wellington's victories. The Versailles settlement, of course, which established a new order after the First World War, Britain central. The Yalta and Potsdam settlements, which ended the Second World War. Britain was fundamental to all these orders. She was less central, perhaps, during the Cold War, but still the most important Western European actor throughout. So the whole European security order upon which the European Union is built was, to a considerable extent, constructed with British blood and treasure. So that's the order that emerged from this great schism. In France, the boot was on the other foot. Protestantism was completely defeated. Royal power triumphed over representative assemblies. The French church was very much under the control of the crown, a phenomenon known as Gallicanism. The more aesthetic and purified form of Catholicism practiced there was known as Jansenism. But France was still inside the old church. Indeed, the King of France called himself His Most Christian Majesty, to rival the pretensions of the King of Spain, who was styled His Most Catholic Majesty. France, too, became an ordering power in Europe, though a less effective and long-lasting one than the United Kingdom. But in Germany, the Great Schism resulted in a very different settlement, both religiously and politically. The carnage of the 30 Years' War ended with the treaties of Westphalia in 1648, anniversary, of course, this year. These enshrined a system of power sharing between Catholics, Lutherans, and Calvinists, which was guaranteed by external powers, in the first instance by France and Sweden. Contrary to myth, Westphalia did not mark the emergence of the modern sovereign nation-state. Quite the opposite. Sovereignty, as I hinted at the start, was diffused because it was feared the German princes would abuse that sovereignty against their subjects and plunge Central Europe back into war. And partly because outside powers feared that their rivals might use the unified powers of the Holy Roman Empire, of Germany, in order to achieve hegemony in Europe. So neutralizing that space was absolutely key. This arrangement worked well for many years. Religious differences in Germany did not disappear. In fact, they endure in different ways to this day, but they were substantially detoxified. Political conflict was juridified to the workings of the imperial courts. Tyrannical rulers were constrained and sometimes deposed if their actions threatened the internal peace of the empire, either by plunging Germany back into civil war or by inviting outside intervention. The downside of this system was that the Holy Roman Empire lacked the internal coherence to resist external predators over the long term, and it eventually collapsed under the onslaught of the French Revolution and Napoleon. Another sort of compromise was reached in parts of Eastern Europe, which had been contested between Orthodoxy and Catholicism. The Uniate Church effectively split the difference. It had not acknowledged papal authority, but followed a Byzantine or an Eastern liturgy, the opposite of the late Henrician Reformation in England. I want you to park that thought because I'm going to come back to it right at the end. So this order lasted about 200 years and survived serious challenges. From the early 20th century, however, Europe was once again convulsed by a time of troubles in which ideologies, states, and nations faced off against each other in what both Charles de Gaulle and Winston Churchill immediately after called, with good reason, the Second 30 Years' War between 1914 and 1945. You know all about it. Like its predecessor, it was a savage ideological conflict, this time a three-sided contest between Nazism, communism, and Western democracy. And like the 30 Years' War, its main focus had been Germany. Now, in some respects, the order that emerged from this bore a remarkable resemblance to that which had followed the great 17th century conflagrations. At first, Germany was neutralized, becoming once again an object rather than a subject of the European system. The Federal Republic slowly regained its right to participate in European politics on the understanding that she remained embedded in the wider structures of European integration. And I would argue, this is part of my meta point, that the way in which Germans accept those constraints even today goes back to the fact that they are familiar with them and the diffusion of sovereignty from the period of the Holy Roman Empire and indeed their period of lack of sovereignty for important parts of the 19th and 20th century. So she was embedded within the wider structures of European integration. The United Kingdom joined these in 1973, and thereafter London did much of its ordering in Europe through the European Economic Community, as it was then, and later through the European Union. The European Union resembled both a church and an empire. Its hold over the imaginations and emotions of many Europeans was something like that of a religious faith. These Europeans might be diverse and fractious, but they were all part of a single whole. A new order was born, one in which the divisions originating in the Reformation and deepened by centuries of conflict in between were slowly healed. The European Union was often likened to the old Holy Roman Empire, with its emphasis on rules and the juridification of political conflict. It was a geo-economic order centered on the customs union, the single market, free movement, and the Schengen zone, which of course you're all familiar with. And above all, the European Union was a geo-legal order in which union law prevailed over national law. Once again, a wronged woman in Yorkshire could appeal to a higher court, the ECJ, rather than those of the land. There was a general sense that there could be no prosperity, no security, no law, and even no salvation outside of the European Union. In the first few years of the 21st century, it seemed, in fact, as if European history had come to an end. Wars, if they were fought at all, were ones of choice. Much of old Europe participated in the war in Afghanistan, but opted out of the occupation of Iraq. Combat happened in far-off places, even if the consequences in terms of terrorism and domestic radicalization were felt closer to home. Russia seemed quiescent to many. The old post-war order still stood. NATO and the European Union remained the principal ordering powers in Europe. The former provided geopolitical security through the Article 5 guarantee of mutual defense, while the latter appeared to have created a geo-economic and geopolitical order, which I've described, which had banished war, juridified conflict, and generally rendered classic European great power politics a thing of the past. Through her membership of both organizations, the United Kingdom remained closely involved in the political management of the continent of Europe, while maintaining control over key areas of national life, such as border controls and the currency. Within the British Isles, some of the long-standing conflicts seem to have been pacified by the various devolution settlements. In Northern Ireland, the power-sharing assembly established by the Good Friday Agreement at Stormont appeared stable. It looked as if the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly had satisfied demands for greater autonomy. All of these solutions were arrived at largely independently of Brussels, but the wider European framework was certainly very helpful in implementing them and in providing a context within which intractable questions of identity could be contained, if not resolved. The notion that the European Union might divide the four nations of the British Isles from each other once again seemed remote. That said, by the first decade of the 21st century, this order was already under some pressure. German influence was increasing, so that many felt that a structure which had originally been designed to contain the power of Berlin was actually facilitating it. The structure of the common currency was causing severe balances in the Eurozone. As with the old Holy Roman Empire, there was a striking mismatch between the European Union's aspirations and its capabilities. It was a geo-economic and a geo-legal order, but not a geopolitical one. And we saw this then on the eastern flank as the Union was challenged by Russia's leader, Vladimir Putin, who unleashed a cyber war on Estonia in 2007, invaded far-off Georgia in 2008, and, of course, was beginning to lean on nearby Ukraine. Finally, there were grumbles from Britain, which had always been an awkward European, and these were growing louder. There was the growth of Euroscepticism within the Conservative Party and the country at large, fueled by resentment at the rising tide of immigration from the European Union, under, of course, the EU's principle of free movement, as the relative dynamism of the British economy sucked in labour from across the Union. You're all familiar with this. The resulting pressure on services greatly increased support for the United Kingdom Independence Party. The European arrest warrant, which some skeptics described as, quote, leaving Britain in handcuffs, provoked resistance. That's simply an example. There was a general sense among many that the United Kingdom was being ordered by the European Union in a way that fundamentally compromised her sovereignty. Still, the idea that Britain would leave the European Union seemed as remote then as the notion that England would break away from the old church did around 1500. Over the past 8 years, however, Europe has been so violently convulsed by crises that we can indeed speak of another age of schism. First to emerge was the North-South cleavage. The Eurozone bubble on the periphery burst, creating unsustainable private and banking debts in some countries and a sovereign debt crisis in others. This began in Greece, and the country remains effectively in European Union care. It soon spread to Ireland, Portugal, and Spain. More recently, the populist government in Italy has refused to bow to the fiscal rules laid down by the Eurogroup. So there's now a fundamental divide between Northern Europe, which holds the purse strings and demands compliance, and the inverted commas South, which is groaning on the impact of austerity and whose young people have been forced to emigrate in search of work. The more Chancellor Merkel, whom the historian and commentator Neil Ferguson has dubbed the Holy German Empress, insists on the rules, the less the South feels part of this larger Commonwealth. That's the first rent. Next, Europe was rent by the Eastern Schism. Member states such as Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Bulgaria increasingly felt culturally alienated from the Central and Western European liberal mainstream on issues like migration and same-sex marriage, for example. For all the nationalist antagonism to Putin's Russia, there was some sympathy with his view that the European Union had betrayed Christian values. This division became manifest when some Eastern European countries refused to take even a token number of refugees from Syria, after the civil war there spiraled out of control. There was also a big question mark over the reach of the EU's legal order, as Eastern European governments ignored rulings on the independence of the judiciary and of the press. Eastern Europe began to become a fundamentally different place with a distinct political culture. All this was aggravated by a schism not merely between the member states, but within them. These had long existed, but the economic crisis, and especially the appearance of around 1 million new migrants from Syria and other parts of the Middle East in late 2015, led to a surge in right and left-wing populism, even in the Franco-German core. So in the latest German federal elections, as you know, the AfD doubled its vote to more than 12%. And of course, in the French presidential elections, the National Front secured a full third of votes in the second round. So that really is a fundamental schism within the core. But of course, the greatest breach in the European order was the Brexit vote of June 2016. This signaled the departure of the United Kingdom from the geo-economic and geo-legal system of the European Union. Now, there are many issues at stake in the referendum, but the fundamental question was whether Britain should accept serious constraints on her sovereignty in order to remain part of a larger Commonwealth, or whether it would reassert the primacy of laws made and arbitrated by Westminster and UK courts alone. The Brexit project was thus Empire 2.0, not so much in the global 19th century sense, but in the sense of making the United Kingdom, in the language of the 1533 Parliamentary Act of Appeals, which I mentioned earlier, once more an empire unto itself. In other words, a sovereign, legal, and political space, which of course is what the Reformation had been all about. This was primarily an assertion of authority rather than the articulation of doctrinal difference. In other words, what you then actually do with those powers once you have them. It was, as it were, a Henry VIII moment. The response of the European Union to this challenge, in some respects, resembled that of the old Church and Catholic Europe to the Reformation. This sentiment was manifest in the response of the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, to the Prime Minister's hope that one could, quote, make a success of Brexit. Brexit, he said, and was very telling, cannot be a success. There could be no salvation outside the Union, just as there was no salvation outside the Church. Brexit was an offence not merely to the European order, but to the European imaginary. That's the sort of gulf that we face. So when the European Union began the Brexit talks, it did so not with the understanding that, as I would argue, the European system is historically co-owned by the United Kingdom and the European Union, but rather that Britain was defecting from the only legitimate geo-legal order. This was reflected in the European Union's sequencing demands at the start of the negotiation. First, the United Kingdom would have to settle its bill. Then it would have to provide guarantees on the Irish border, making clear that the only assurances the European Union would accept involved the so-called backstop, which would, if necessary, extrude Northern Ireland from the geo-economic and geo-legal order of the United Kingdom, or at least important parts of it. Only then, thirdly, would the European Union consider the future relationship, including the all-important question, at least for Britain, of trade. So it treated the United Kingdom, in effect, as a schismatic, rather than as an equal partner. And you can see, from its own point of view, why it did so. Strikingly, the UK government and its negotiators not just accepted the European Union's framework, but also seems to have internalized the thinking behind it. This is not surprising, as the discussions were led by a Remain Prime Minister and conducted by civil service mandarins, whose entire professional and cultural formation had taken place within the European Union. It's rather like entrusting the English Reformation to the English cardinals. It may be that the British negotiators were calculating and allowed the EU to narrow the options so that the country would end up with the solution they wanted, which was to keep the UK aligned as closely as possible to the legal order of the European Union. And one might understand why they would want to do that. Most likely, however, they simply could not conceive of the problems in any other way than they had been used to over the past 30 years or so. And I think the resulting deal agreed by the Prime Minister with the European Union reflects all this. It is, if you like, the opposite of the Henrician Reformation. It offers a clear liturgical break with the European Union, for example, through the end of free movement, but it is likely that much of the country will remain under the authority of a foreign politico-legal order. During the transition period, the United Kingdom will remain part of the customs union, in which the ultimate say will rest with the European Court of Justice. Now, the UK can leave this arrangement unilaterally, but only at the cost of ceding Northern Ireland permanently to the EU customs union and erecting a customs barrier on the territory of the United Kingdom. This, in turn, can be avoided only by the entire UK staying within the customs union. You're familiar with this. Now, if you look at this historically, you can see that Ireland, in other words, has once again served as the backdoor to England. And it can't be any other way. Either Ireland is the backdoor to England, or it is the backdoor into Europe for England. Of course, Europeans understood that very well. That's why you have the sequencing demand. In the meantime, the entire United Kingdom will be subject to EU rules on trade, current and future environmental legislation, labour and social laws, and state aid, without having a voice in making. It is therefore not surprising to find a leading Brexiteer, Boris Johnson, arguing that the Prime Minister's plan to remain under some EU laws was in violation of the repealed Statute of Praemunire, which I mentioned earlier. The proposed deal also differs from the Henrician Reformation and the subsequent history of this country in another fundamental respect. For hundreds of years, the United Kingdom has been, as I've shown, not merely a self-governing, but also an ordering power in Europe. The treaty on offer, by contrast, excludes Britain from the general ordering system of the continent. If you prefer, you can say that she has excluded herself. But the point remains that that is a major shift in the European balance. So, to begin to come to a conclusion, some of the contours of the new post-schism European order are already clear. It seems likely that the old Church and Empire, the European Union, will continue to hold sway over much of Central and Western Europe. It has acquired a doughty champion in France's President Macron. His reform policies, I would say, are very much in the Jansenist tradition, while its insistence on the French national interest within a larger European sovereignty make him the true heir of Gallicanism. The East is increasingly uniate, in other words, politically tied to the European Union, but liturgically, that is to say culturally, it's more and more Byzantine. For now, we cannot be sure how Britain will fit in. It could go three ways. A people's vote or some other change of heart could return her to the old church, to the European Union. That, of course, is the plan of Andrew Adonis. It could follow the uniate model of remaining under aspects of EU authority, but cultivate liturgical difference on areas like immigration. And that, of course, is the PM's plan. Or it could go for a fully fledged political Anglicanism, that is, the complete separation from the continent and its authority. And that, of course, is what the Brexiteers of people like Dominic Raab and David Davis are arguing for. A lot will depend on what happens next, obviously. The old church remains strong in many parts of the United Kingdom, especially Scotland and Northern Ireland, but also in southern England, in the universities and in the professions. Because of demographic shifts, peak Remain will in fact be in about 20 years' time. For this reason, all else being equal, Brexit will only be irreversible once the first full generation of those who have reached political maturity outside the European Union reach their 70 years and 10. By my reckoning, that would be around 2080. Just as England really only ceased being a Catholic country many decades, possibly even 100 years, after the Reformation. So this is a generational project if it succeeds. After that point, the Remainers or returners will become recusants, prominent perhaps in the seats of learning or muttering strange oaths at private masses, yet no longer a force to be reckoned with. But of course, in European geopolitics, things are never equal. Like the Reformation, the future of Brexit will be determined at least as much by outside powers. The EU, for instance, could so marginalise the United Kingdom that return becomes the only remedy to penury and irrelevance. That's a possibility. Alternatively, the European Union might provoke a hostile reaction and thereby deepen Brexit. That's, of course, what happened during the Reformation. It was as much made by the response of Europe as it was made by the reformers, by Henry. Just as the reign of Mary Tudor, as I've said, led to a fatal association between Catholicism, foreign domination, and strategic incompetence, so could Remain or Return be tarred with the same brush. We don't know. The future, of course, is open. So as my lecture concludes, we are left with more questions than answers. Will the Brexit project endure, or will it be capsized by domestic or international headwinds? Will Brexit be reversed by a Marianne reaction, or will the original clash of authority be followed by a further deepening cultural divide on the scale of the Reformation as well? Will it be just authority, or will it also be liturgy? Or will it be just liturgy and not authority? Will England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland be ordered by the United Kingdom, inside or outside the European Union, or will they be ordered by the European Union without their participation? Even if Westminster manages to assert its authority over the home islands, how, if at all, will the United Kingdom discharge its own ordering functions on the continent of Europe once outside the European Union? Will the European Union recognise the exceptionality of the United Kingdom, if such it is, and accept the co-management of our continent, or are Britain and the rest of Europe condemned to another destructive clash of ordering claims? History, of course, does not answer those questions, but it does give us a sense of the price to be paid if we get it wrong. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Brent, for this very interesting and kurzweiligen and very, very thoughtful talk you gave us, and lecture. And I suppose that there are, not only you had a lot of questions, but I think also our audience has a lot of questions. So I would like to give you the floor, and whoever would like to ask or comment, please. If you grab the microphone and don't stand up, oh, yes, that one, and don't stand up, but please tell your name before you ask your question, please. Here's one. Will you use this one? No,
My first?
yes.
Okay, why not? Norman Rosenthal is my name. I thought that was an amazing survey of 500 years, and I've always thought the concept of the very words Church of England being a very strange, almost queer concept. And one of the things I've got many, many questions that could be addressed out of your lecture. One is the relationship of the Church of England to the Protestantism in Europe, which I suspect was virtually nothing. But you please answer that possibly. I suppose the other crazy thing about the current situation, as you said, there is no way of telling what the future will be, but because this kind of crazy adventure of the moment, we are at obviously the very crucial moment, is it's full of questions. And the other thing that you never mentioned, of course, is the relationship of the wider scene, that's to say, America, and the idea of, as it were, the thing is that Britain will not have a colonial empire to fall back on. At least I think it's rather unlikely.
So, the technical answer is that the Church of England is in communion with certain churches in Europe, like the Lusitanian Church, for example. At that time, that I don't know, to be honest. But its relationship with continental church was essentially a strategic one. In other words, they were the bulwarks of essentially part of their defensive system to keep out Catholicism. So in other words, you would have alliances with Protestant princes, both Calvinist and Lutheran. So that was an important part of the defensive mechanism. When exactly they moved into communion with those individual churches, I'm not sure. I just keep telling you what the situation is now. Probably. Now, as far as the bigger picture is concerned, I think that you're right, of course, that Britain no longer has an empire, although its overseas possessions are not trivial in this European context. If you think of Gibraltar and sovereign bases and Cyprus, which are still very important parts of the geopolitical chessboard. The point I tried to make in my book on Britain and Europe is that actually the empire, the overseas empire, is a little bit of a distraction in this respect, because it encourages the assumption that England or Britain only matters because of its empire. Whereas in fact, it's the other way around. The empire is as much a product of the strength of the home islands as it is a contributor to it. So that, England is a huge player in Europe long before the empire. The kings of England go on crusade, they hold large parts of France and so on. And so the point that I really make is that even without the empire, you're talking within the United Kingdom about an actor which is still very, very large in global terms. You're talking about the fifth largest economy. You're talking about a nuclear power, a seat on the Security Council. And within the European context, it's an even bigger actor. So I wouldn't, from that point of view, I wouldn't emphasize the loss of empire in the calculus vis-a-vis continental Europe. I think it's still a very important player. And they know that, which is why this is such a difficult discussion. Because, in the case of Greece, they were encouraging Greece to leave the European Union. They were saying, you can leave, and essentially your punishment is to go back to being Greece. And, we'll help you, it doesn't have to be a disaster, and that sort of thing. Whereas in the case of the United Kingdom, it's very different, because they can sense that the one thing they can't really allow is for the United Kingdom simply to go back to being the United Kingdom. There has to be a price to be paid. Oh, the USA. So yeah, that's a really interesting wild card. So it's hard to know exactly how this will play out. Some people, as you know, will have said, there are these deals to be made, free trade deals with the US. Others say that the erratic nature of Mr. Trump. I actually wrote a book about Trump, about his foreign policy. And so it is unfortunately consistent in the sense that he's a protectionist with a very low opinion of his allies. So the UK can't necessarily rely on that link. Paradoxically, in terms of the power relationship between the UK and mainland Europe, Trump hates mainland Europe and the European Union so much that in a way it redounds only in that respect to the advantage of the United Kingdom. So it makes the European Union more dependent, for example, on the UK in defence terms, because if the US guarantee under Article 5 is under a question mark, then of course the remaining principal actor in the Western side is the UK. So that helps. On the other hand, his protectionism doesn't help. I had a sort of cheap shot in my lecture, which I didn't include, but now I can loose off, which is that, of course, the Brexiteers need their William of Orange, but the only thing that's orange about Trump is his hair. But it's a cheap shot.
So we had this gentleman.
Me? Hello, my name is David Goodheart. I'm an author and work at a think tank called Policy Exchange. I really enjoyed the talk. You sort of paint this picture of the Church and Empire closing ranks and Britain sort of on the outside, sort of colder and possibly poorer and powerless. But as the first question pointed out, I mean, this isn't the 16th century any longer. We are tied into all sorts of other connections, NATO, the UN, as you said, fifth largest economy, all those kinds of things. And the other way of looking at the whole story is a sort of concentric circles one, that there's the Eurozone, which is the core, there's the kind of the non-Euro EU members, and then there's a sort of third tier of Europe, which we are now joining. We perhaps had the opportunity to lead a more formal second tier, but didn't take that up. The time when it might have been most rational to do that was when it was clear we were going to have a political and not an economic euro in the mid to late 1990s, but that was the time when we were having a brief burst of kind of neo-federalism under Blair. Anyway, so we missed that opportunity, and the only person who's consistently argued for that is David Owen. We missed that opportunity, so we're now kind of in the third tier, but isn't it quite likely that these three sort of concentric circles are going to become kind of looser, that the Church and Empire will hang together in a certain sort of very loose way, but actually, it won't be sort of firm in the way that it was in the 16th, 17th, 18th century Europe, perhaps. So the analogy sort of slightly breaks down in that way. I should also just point out, I was at Lambeth Palace the other day for a meeting of Anglican bishops to talk about Brexit, and it was called sort of the theology of Brexit. And it emerged. I mean, the reason why they are so completely irrelevant to this story, I think, is that somebody told me that of the, I think, roughly 125 Anglican bishops, only one of them voted for Brexit. I mean, they are just sort of, they are Andrew Adonis a prayer, essentially, the Anglican Church at the moment.
Thank you. So, of course, when I was referring to Anglicanism, I meant political Anglicanism. I wasn't, so it's the political equivalent today. I would disagree with you on this idea that the UK is now necessarily going to be in an outer tier, or the third tier, because this is really what I was raising towards the end of my lecture, is that as far as the European Union is concerned for the moment, it's not going to be in any tier at all. It's simply outside of the order. And so I personally don't think that's credible as a long-term proposition. I think this country is always going to be hugely important, and therefore we need to find some way of restitching it into the European order and the European balance. But at the moment, the European position is that there will be no significant UK input through some equivalent of its membership of the European Union. And this then raises the interesting question, and brings us to your point about NATO, is that the geo-legal and geo-economic orders do not actually tally with the geopolitical one. And so we're in a very strange situation that the United Kingdom is committed to defend the European Union on its eastern border. In fact, is doing more than any other European country to defend the territory of the European Union. And yet at the same time is being told, for all the reasons we've discussed, that it's going to have no further input in the running of that European Union, which might in fact be very relevant to the defence guarantee. For instance, expansion of the EU, might that provoke the Russians? So at the moment, the European Union, the United Kingdom will be on the hook for bailing out the European Union for a decision it will have taken without input from the United Kingdom. So it's rather like as if, Philip II had said that, Elizabeth should really defend him against the Turk, while at the same time, excommunicating her and sending economic armadas. So it's a very strange situation. Obviously, people didn't expect to be in that. And I think the great danger is, in fact, of British Trumpism, because unless the European Union finds a way of readmitting the United Kingdom into the political management of the continent, the voice will grow louder and louder of people saying, well, if they are actually trying to hammer us economically, if they're trying to break up the United Kingdom through the backstop and so on, not, of course, in a malicious sense, I understand why they're trying to do it. There may be some element of malice in one or two of the actors, but I can see the logic. But nevertheless, it will then become very difficult to argue that the United Kingdom has got to protect this European Union. And so that's where I see the fundamental tension ahead.
Thank you. My name is Stephen Warrington. You talked a lot about authority and liturgy and the legitimate source of both of those over the last few hundred years. Obviously, economics is a relatively new subject, but clearly in the current debate, economics plays a big role, and the Remainers in particular would point to particularly short-term economic advantages of remaining. Is there anything to be said about the role of economics or the perception of a more material well-being as you look back over the last 400 or 500 years and the schisms of that time?
Well, first of all, I'm not an economist. I'd be a lot richer, I'm sure, if I were. And of course, it's a counterfactual, which is impossible to do. What would have been the economic history of what became the UK had there been no Reformation? Of course, the economic links continue, and indeed are quite extensive even after the Reformation. I just actually don't think that the economic dimension is in the end what it's all about. Because the economic, I'm convinced that in 30 years' time, if Brexit is reversed in 30 years' time, then the economic situation will be as it is. If Brexit is not reversed, I'm fairly confident that in 30 years' time, the United Kingdom will be in roughly the same place economically than it would have been if it hadn't Brexited. But what I also know is that it will be a very, very different country. It will be like the country it would have been had it never joined the European Union. It will be again a sundering. That's the key point. It will just be different. Whether it's better or worse, I can't say for now, but it will be different. And I don't think in the end that these questions can be solved economically or with reference to economics. In the short term, the economic argument has to be Remain, because Brexit must bring a substantial economic hit, and a no-deal Brexit is the equivalent of war. What we're seeing now is the working out of things which historically were decided by a different form of arbitrament. So it's very easy to say, you Remain, and you have no economic problems. That's not what it's about. It's about authority and legitimate authority and who makes the laws. You can very reasonably say, actually, through the European Union, we have a better say in the making of laws and the general running of things than we have outside. That's an argument, by the way, which I would accept for my own country, Ireland. I mean, we either were part of the European Union or we're part of the United Kingdom. And it will be true of almost every other country in Europe, except for Germany, which for the reasons I've given can't be allowed, or isn't being allowed, to be sovereign. And so the meta question we have before us is the United Kingdom in that sweet spot where it is large enough and strong enough to survive after some turbulence on its own, or is it simply another one of those European countries? If I was forced to choose, I would say it's actually an exceptional actor. Does that mean it has to exercise that exceptionalism? It's a different question.
maybe one last question, because afterwards we can go on talking with a glass of wine and some snacks upstairs in the library. So, one last question.
Paul Hopper, on the back of that last point, my son David, who was a pupil of yours at Peterhouse incidentally, has pointed out that the vote share and the number of votes cast in the Brexit referendum, were virtually the same as the election in Germany in 1933. Should we therefore be fearful of the next 12 years?
I won't, you'll forgive me if I don't go all the way with that, but I think we should always be fearful. Any moment like this, which is a fundamental breach in established structures, however good the reasons for them, it is a moment to pause and to reflect. So I am anxious. I mean, if I'm perfectly honest, I'm much less worried about you chaps, because you will probably be all right. You always have been historically, and most likely always will be. What I'm concerned about is the rest of Europe. If you think of all the problems we have, you know, I describe them: the euro, the migration issue, the economic issue, the Russian challenge, terrorism, and so on. If on top of that, we end up in a real ordering bust-up between the European Union and the United Kingdom, who should really be friends, that's a self-inflicted wound that I'd like to avoid. So yes, I am anxious.
Thank you again for this inspiring, also for your questions. I think it's a serious situation, but maybe we can loosen it up a little with the wine and the snacks. It's upstairs in the library. We are all invited. Thank you very much.